All right, ready to dive deep into the world of dopamine.
Let's do it.
This isn't just about feeling good, Dopamine is way more than just a happy hormone.
Yeah, it's a chemical messenger, but it does so much in your brain. It's like the puppeteer behind the scenes, pulling all these strings we don't even realize.
We've got a really thorough medical article here and some AI summaries too, so.
Oh, interesting to see how those different perspectives line up.
Exactly. So to kick things off, what exactly is dopamine? I mean, we hear the word thrown around a lot.
It's easy to oversimplify it, right?
Yeah.
At its core, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. That basically means it's a chemical messenger, allowing your brain cells to communicate with each other.
Like a tiny little email system, zipping messages between neurons.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Dopamine isn't just a neurotransmitter. It's also a hormone.
Okay, wait, so both. I thought those were separate things.
We tend to think of them that way, but dopamine kind of blurs the lines. As a hormone, it can act on different parts of the body, not just the brain.
So it's not confined to just our thoughts and feelings.
Nope. Dopamine is playing a role in things like movement, focus, even how your kidneys function. It's pretty wild.
Okay, that's already blowing my mind a little. So how does this one chemical manage to do so much? The article mentions these 4 main pathways in the brain.
Right. It's not just one dopamine doing everything. These pathways are like highways in your brain, each with specific stops where dopamine can connect and exert its influence. We call those stops receptors.
So like a targeted delivery system, dopamine goes where it's needed, depending on which pathway it's on.
Precisely. And one of the most well-known pathways is the reward system. You know, that feeling of satisfaction you get when you achieve a goal or bite into a delicious piece of cake.
Oh yeah, I definitely know that feeling.
That's a dopamine surge, rewarding you for the behavior and making you want to do it again.
So that's why I can never resist dessert. But the article also talks about how this reward system can be a bit of a double-edged sword, especially when it comes to addiction.
Exactly. Think about drugs like cocaine. They basically hijack this reward system, flooding your brain with so much dopamine that it overwhelms your natural reward circuits.
So it's like your brain gets used to these artificially high levels of dopamine, and then normal things just don't cut it anymore. That's kind of scary.
It is. And what's even more concerning is that over time, this constant bombardment can actually decrease your brain's natural dopamine production. So when you're not using the drug, you experience these intense lows, making you crave it even more.
That's a really good point. It's not just dopamine being good or bad, it's about balance. Speaking of which, the article also mentions serotonin, another neurotransmitter that's linked to happiness.
It's easy to get them confused, but they have distinct roles. Think of serotonin as more about your overall mood and well-being, that sense of contentment.
Okay, so like a steady baseline.
Exactly. While dopamine is more about the drive and motivation you feel towards specific rewards, it's what gets you up and moving, striving for that next goal.
So serotonin is like the background music setting the overall mood, and dopamine is the catchy tune that gets you dancing.
I like that. And sometimes they work together, sometimes they might even inhibit each other. It's a complex dance, but getting that balance right is crucial for our mental health.
Which brings us to the link between dopamine and mental health conditions. The article emphasizes that imbalances can play a pretty big role, right?
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting because for a long time we thought of mental health conditions as purely psychological. But now we're understanding how much brain chemistry is involved, specifically these neurotransmitters like dopamine.
So too much or too little dopamine in the wrong places can actually manifest as real, tangible symptoms.
Precisely. Take schizophrenia, for example. Imbalances in certain dopamine pathways can lead to hallucinations and delusions. Imagine hearing voices that aren't there. That's a direct consequence of messed up dopamine signaling.
Wow, that's intense. And what about ADHD? The article suggests a connection there too.
There's a growing body of evidence that suggests ADHD may be linked to a dopamine shortage, potentially even something you're born with.
So for someone struggling with focus and attention, it could be that their brain just isn't producing enough of this vital chemical.
Exactly. And that's why medications like Ritalin, which boosts dopamine levels, can be so effective in managing those ADHD symptoms.
It really makes you see ADHD in a whole new light. But it's not just mental health conditions. Dopamine plays a role in other diseases as well, right? Like Parkinson's disease, which affects movement.
Absolutely. And this one really drives home the importance of dopamine. You see, in your brain, there's this area called the basal ganglia. It's like your brain's movement control center. And dopamine is essential for smooth communication within this center.
So if there's not enough dopamine in the basal ganglia, things get all jumbled up.
Exactly. And that's what happens in Parkinson's disease. The cells that produce dopamine in the basal ganglia start to deteriorate. This leads to those characteristic tremors, stiffness, and difficulty with movement.
So for someone with Parkinson's, those tremors are a direct result of low dopamine.
It's a perfect example of how understanding the role of dopamine opens up possibilities for targeted treatments.
Uh-huh.
But get this, dopamine can also be a hero.
Wait, what do you mean?
You might be surprised to learn that dopamine can actually be a lifesaver.
Hold on, how so? I thought we were talking about it causing problems.
Well, it turns out dopamine plays a crucial role in regulating your blood vessels. It helps them constrict and dilate properly.
Okay, so blood flow.
Exactly. And when someone is experiencing a life-threatening condition, like dangerously low blood pressure, doctors can actually use a prescription form of dopamine called inotropin.
So it can help stabilize them.
It can be a game changer in those critical situations.
Wow, that's incredible. So dopamine can be both the villain and the hero in our bodies. Talk about a complex character.
It certainly is, and it's a reminder that when it comes to biology, things are rarely black and white. It's all about understanding the nuances, the interactions, and the delicate balance that keeps us functioning.
That's a really great point. So with all this talk about dopamine levels, how do doctors even figure out if someone has too much or too little? Is there a blood test?
If only it were that simple. Unfortunately, we can't just measure dopamine levels directly in the blood.
Oh, so how do they do it?
It's more like detective work. Doctors have to rely on a combination of clues, your medical history, your lifestyle, and most importantly, what you're feeling and experiencing.
So it's like a puzzle, piecing together all these different pieces to get the full picture.
Exactly. And what are some of those pieces? Well, when your dopamine is balanced, you generally feel happy, motivated, alert, focused. You're able to enjoy things, learn new things, move through your day with a sense of purpose.
Sounds like a pretty good state to be in.
It is. But when things are out of whack, you'll start to notice some telltale signs.
Like what? What should people be looking out for?
If your dopamine levels are low, you might experience lack of motivation. Maybe you lose interest in activities you used to enjoy. You might feel fatigued, have trouble concentrating, even struggle with sleep.
So it's not just feeling sad.
Some people report feeling more anxious or sad, but it can manifest in many ways.
So those common complaints like, I'm so tired or I can't focus, could actually be tied to low dopamine. Huh, that's really interesting. What about if you have too much dopamine?
Well, that might sound appealing at first, but it can also lead to problems. You might feel euphoric and energetic, but this can come with downsides like difficulty sleeping, increased impulsivity, even aggression.
So too much of a good thing, huh? That's pretty counterintuitive.
It is, and it reinforces that point we made earlier. It's all about balance. Dopamine isn't inherently good or bad. It's about having the right amount in the right places at the right times.
That makes a lot of sense. So if someone is concerned about their dopamine levels, are there things they can do to naturally boost it?
That's a great question. And while there's still so much research being done in this area, there are some promising avenues. For example, some studies suggest that certain foods might be beneficial, particularly those high in magnesium and tyrosine.
And tyrosine, that's a precursor to dopamine, right? Like the raw material your brain uses to make it.
You got it. Good sources include things like chicken, almonds, even apples. Magnesium is important too. You can find that in leafy green vegetables, green tea, even dark chocolate.
Hold on, dark chocolate. Now you're speaking MY language. But seriously, it's fascinating to think that our everyday food choices can actually influence something as profound as brain chemistry.
It really is. And it's not just about what you eat. Engaging in activities that bring you joy and relaxation can also naturally increase dopamine release.
So things like spending time in nature, pursuing a hobby, connecting with loved ones, all those good things can give our dopamine a boost.
Absolutely. Even simple things like listening to music, reading a good book, or meditating can have a positive impact. It's about finding those activities that nourish your soul and make you feel truly alive.
I definitely feel that surge of motivation after a good hike or getting lost in a good book. But for those who want a little extra help, are there supplements that can boost dopamine levels as well?
There are. But, like with any supplement, it's always important to talk to your doctor first. Some options that have shown promise include tyrosine supplements, L-theanine, certain B vitamins, and omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay, so we've got diet, lifestyle, and even supplements. It seems like there are a lot of tools in the toolbox when it comes to managing dopamine.
There are. And there's also a trend that's been gaining traction lately that we should discuss: dopamine detox or dopamine fasting.
Ah, yes, that idea of resetting your brain by cutting out all pleasure. But the article makes it clear that it's not as simple as it sounds.
Not at all. Your body doesn't just stop producing dopamine because you decide to avoid pleasurable activities. Dopamine fasting, as it's more accurately called, is about strategically managing your behaviors, not depriving yourself completely.
So less about eliminating all joy and more about regaining control over those things that might be hijacking our dopamine system.
Precisely. It was originally developed by Dr. Cameron Sipa as a type of therapy, a cognitive behavioral therapy technique. It was meant to help people with impulsive and addictive behaviors.
Oh, so it has clinical roots.
It does. It's not about never enjoying those things again. It's about regaining a sense of control, breaking those automatic patterns.
So for someone who finds themselves constantly checking social media or reaching for that bag of chips when they're stressed, dopamine fasting could be a way to interrupt that cycle.
Exactly. Imagine you're reaching for that chocolate cake again. It's that dopamine surge making you crave it. But if you can pause, even for a little while, you start to weaken that automatic response.
So it's like hitting the reset button on those cravings.
In a way, yes. And the article lists some pretty common targets for dopamine fasting: emotional eating, excessive internet use, shopping sprees, even things like gambling or thrill-seeking behaviors.
It's about identifying those areas where you feel like you're on autopilot, doing things without really thinking.
Exactly. Those things that are maybe controlling you more than you'd like.
So how does someone actually DO a dopamine fast? Is it like going cold turkey on all those things?
Not necessarily. It's much more effective to start slowly and gradually increase the duration and intensity. The key is to find a rhythm that works for you without creating unnecessary stress.
So maybe start with a few hours a day without social media, then work your way up to a whole day, kind of like easing into a new exercise routine.
That's a great analogy. And just like with exercise, you'll want to find healthy alternatives to fill that void. Remember all those things we talked about that naturally boost dopamine: spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies, connecting with loved ones? This is where those come in.
So instead of reaching for your phone when you're bored, maybe pick up a book, go for a walk, or call a friend. It's about replacing those quick hits of dopamine with something more nourishing.
That's the idea. It's about retraining your brain to find pleasure in those things that truly support your well-being, not just those fleeting moments of instant gratification.
It's like choosing to invest in your long-term happiness rather than constantly chasing those short-term highs. But what about those of us who are, let's say, digitally addicted? I mean, the article does talk about how technology is kind of designed to hijack our dopamine system, right?
It is. Our brains are wired to seek novelty and reward, and tech companies know this. Those notifications, those likes, those endless scrolling feeds, it's all designed to keep us hooked, keep those dopamine hits coming.
So we're basically playing a game that's rigged against us. That's a bit disheartening.
It can be, but the good news is, once you understand the rules of the game, you can start to play it differently.
So it's about becoming more conscious of those triggers, those things that are designed to make us crave that next hit of dopamine.
Exactly. It's about becoming the CEO of your own attention, making deliberate choices about how you spend your time and energy, rather than letting those algorithms dictate your every move.
Being the CEO of your attention, I love that. But how do we actually DO that? It feels like everywhere we turn, there's something trying to grab our attention.
It's true, it's a constant battle. But there are some practical strategies that can help. One powerful approach is to set boundaries.
So, like creating tech-free zones in your home, no phones at the dinner table, scheduling specific times to check email and social media.
Exactly. It's about creating a structure and a rhythm that supports your well-being, rather than constantly being at the mercy of those digital distractions.
And it's not just about limiting technology either. It's also about filling that space with activities that bring you genuine joy and fulfillment.
Like spending time in nature, pursuing creative endeavors, connecting with loved ones, even something as simple as reading a good book.
Exactly. These activities nourish our minds and bodies in ways that technology simply can't replicate. They provide a sense of fulfillment and purpose that goes beyond the fleeting pleasure of a notification or a like.
Beautifully put. And in the process, we're retraining our brains to find joy and satisfaction in those richer, more meaningful pursuits. It's about reclaiming our dopamine receptors, so to
No.
speak, and directing them towards those experiences that truly nourish our souls.
I love that analogy, reclaiming our dopamine receptors. So we're not just passively consuming digital content, but actively creating a life that aligns with our values and brings us genuine happiness.
Exactly. And it's not about becoming Luddites and shunning technology altogether. It's about using it consciously and intentionally as a tool to enhance our lives rather than control them.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance where technology serves us rather than the other way around.
And it's an ongoing journey, not a destination. We're all constantly navigating this dopamine-saturated world, and it's easy to get caught up in the allure of instant gratification. But by understanding how our brains work and making conscious choices, we can reclaim our attention, cultivate healthier habits, and ultimately create a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground here today, from the science of dopamine to its impact on our modern world, and even those strategies we can use to regain control. What a fascinating deep dive.
I agree. It's always rewarding to explore these complex topics and unravel the mysteries of our incredible brains. But remember, this is just a starting point. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more ways to optimize our well-being.
That's so true. I feel like we could talk about this for hours. And for our listener, we hope this deep dive into dopamine is giving you some valuable insights and practical tips to apply to your own life. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding how your brain works is the first step towards creating positive change.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up part one of our dopamine deep dive. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll continue our exploration of this fascinating neurotransmitter.
Welcome back, everyone. I don't know about you, but I'm still reeling from all that dopamine talk. It's amazing how much this one chemical affects us, right?
Right. It's involved in so much. I think last time we left off talking about this idea of dopamine fasting, which I have to admit sounded kind of intimidating at first.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Like some kind of extreme deprivation experiment.
Yeah.
But we learned that's not really what it's about, is it?
Not at all. It's not about completely shutting down dopamine production. Remember, your brain's always making dopamine.
Right. It's not like you can just flip a switch and turn it off.
Exactly. Dopamine fasting is more about being strategic. It's about taking a break from those things that constantly trigger those dopamine surges, those things we might be overdoing.
So more about mindful control than deprivation.
That's a good way to put it. It's about giving your brain a chance to reset, to recalibrate. And remember, it was initially developed as a form of therapy.
Oh, right, by Dr. Cameron Sipa.
Yep. He designed it as a cognitive behavioral therapy technique to help people manage impulsive and addictive behaviors. It's not about never enjoying things again. It's about regaining a sense of control over those things that might be controlling us.
It makes sense when you put it like that. So for someone who can't seem to put their phone down or who always reaches for a bag of chips when they're stressed, dopamine fasting could help.
Exactly. It can help break those automatic patterns.
So imagine reaching for that chocolate cake, the one that's calling your name from the fridge.
We've all been there. It's that dopamine surge that makes it so hard to resist.
Right. But if you can pause, even just for a little bit, you can start to weaken that automatic response, that I need this now feeling.
You start to create a little space between the craving and the action.
I like that. It's about becoming more aware of those triggers and having the power to choose a different response.
And the article lists a whole bunch of common targets for dopamine fasting things, like emotional eating, excessive internet use, shopping sprees, even thrill-seeking behaviors.
It seems like it could be applied to a lot of areas in life.
It can. And the key is to identify those areas where you feel like you're on autopilot, those things that might be controlling you more than you'd like. Those things you do without even thinking about it.
Like scrolling through social media for hours.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But how does someone actually do a dopamine fast? Do you just go cold turkey on everything all at once?
That's what I was wondering, too. It sounds a little intense.
It can be, if you approach it that way. It's much more effective and gentler to start slowly and gradually increase the duration and intensity. It's all about finding a rhythm that works for you.
So maybe starting with a few hours a day without social media, then work up to a whole day.
Exactly. And just like with starting a new exercise routine, you don't want to overdo it at the beginning.
Right, you got to ease into it. But if you're taking a break from those things, what do you do instead?
That's where all those things we talked about that naturally boost dopamine come in. Spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies, connecting with loved ones. It's about filling that space with activities that nourish your soul.
So instead of mindlessly scrolling on your phone, you might go for a walk, pick up a book, or call a friend.
Exactly. You're replacing those quick hits of dopamine with something more meaningful and lasting.
I like that. It's like retraining your brain to find pleasure in things that are actually good for you.
But what about people who are really struggling with technology addiction? The article talks about how it's almost designed to keep us hooked, right?
It is. Tech companies are really good at tapping into those reward circuits in our brains. All those notifications, likes, and endless feeds, they're designed to keep us coming back for more.
It almost feels like we're playing a game that's rigged against us.
It can feel that way, but awareness is the first step. Once you understand how those triggers work, you can start to regain control.
So being more conscious of those things that are designed to make us crave that next dopamine hit.
Exactly. It's about making deliberate choices, becoming the CEO of your own attention.
That's such a great way to put it. But it's hard, isn't it? It feels like we're constantly bombarded with distractions.
It is, but there are things you can do. One really effective strategy is setting boundaries.
You mean like no phones at the dinner table kind of boundaries? Exactly. Maybe you have certain times of day when you don't check email or social media. It's about creating structure, making conscious choices about how you spend your time.
So it's not just about limiting technology, it's also about replacing those habits with things that are good for us.
Like spending time with loved ones, getting creative, or just enjoying some quiet time in nature. Those activities provide a sense of fulfillment that technology just can't replicate.
They nourish our minds and bodies in a different way, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
And in the process, we're retraining our brains to find joy and satisfaction in those deeper, more meaningful pursuits.
I love that visual retraining our brains. So it's not just about consuming content, it's about creating a life that aligns with our values, a life that brings us genuine happiness.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about getting rid of technology altogether. It's about using it consciously, intentionally, as a tool that enhances our lives rather than controls them.
Finding that sweet spot where technology works for us, not the other way around.
And it's an ongoing journey, not a destination. It's so easy to get caught up in the instant gratification of our modern world, but with a little awareness and effort, we can break free.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this dopamine deep dive. I'm still processing everything,
Yeah.
from those pathways in the brain to how it's connected to all these different diseases.
And let's not forget dopamine's role in addiction and how technology is basically tapping into those same reward circuits.
Right, and then that whole dopamine fasting thing. It's like dopamine is this powerful force that can either work for us or against us.
It really is. And I think one of the key takeaways for me is this idea of balance.
Mhm.
We've seen how too much or too little dopamine in the wrong places can lead to all sorts of problems. Remember schizophrenia
Yeah.
or Parkinson's?
And even things like addiction and obesity, it seems like dopamine imbalances are at the root of so many conditions.
Absolutely. And yet we also learned that dopamine can be a lifesaver, literally. Doctors use it to treat those life-threatening situations, remember?
Oh, right. Like when someone's blood pressure crashes, they can use dopamine to stabilize them. So it's not that dopamine is good or bad, it's about context.
Exactly. It's all about balance, having the right amount in the right places at the right times, kind of like everything else in life, really.
So how do we find that balance? Especially in a world that seems to be pushing us towards excess all the time.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with awareness, recognizing those triggers, those things that send us down the dopamine rabbit hole.
So like, if you know checking your phone constantly is a problem, maybe you turn off those notifications.
Exactly. Or if you find yourself stress eating, maybe you explore some healthier coping mechanisms like exercise or meditation.
It's about taking back control, becoming more mindful of our choices.
Absolutely. It's about remembering that real lasting happiness, that sense of fulfillment. It doesn't come from constantly chasing that next dopamine hit. It comes from something deeper.
It comes from those genuine connections, from pursuing those things that give our lives meaning.
Exactly. And from making choices that align with our values. It's like choosing to invest in our long-term well-being instead of constantly seeking those quick fixes that leave us feeling empty.
You know, I've been thinking about this whole deep dive, and I keep coming back to that idea of retraining our brains. It's like we've been given this owner's manual, and now we can actually start making some adjustments.
I love that analogy. It's about understanding the system and then figuring out how to optimize it. And it's a process, right? It takes time and effort.
It does. But it's also incredibly empowering, don't you think? To realize that we have this ability to shape our own experience, to make choices that support our well-being.
Absolutely. And, it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. We're all going to have those moments where we fall back into old patterns. But the important thing is to keep learning and growing.
To keep striving for that balance that allows us to truly thrive.
Exactly. And on that note, I want to thank you for having this conversation with me. It's been fascinating.
It really has. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of dopamine and its impact on my life. And for our listener, we hope you've enjoyed this journey into the world of dopamine. Remember, knowledge is power.
Understanding how your brain works, that's the first step towards creating positive change. So as you go about your day, as you reach for your phone, as you make those choices about how you spend your time, remember what we've talked about.
Remember the power of dopamine and use that knowledge to make choices that truly support your well-being. Choose joy, choose connection, choose to live a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. Thanks for joining us.